So it's good to be here. David and I both from UHCAN, Ohio, Universal Healthcare Action Network of Ohio. Our organization is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that builds the consumer voice to achieve quality, affordable, accessible healthcare for all Ohioans. We work to inform and unite consumers and their allies to influence decision makers so that all Ohioans can get the care they need at a price they can afford. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself, and then David will introduce himself. We've both been in UHCAN, Ohio together since 2010, and I actually got there in 2008. David and I had an opportunity to do some consultant work together with UHCAN, Ohio before that time. I have been doing healthcare policy and community development type work since about 1983, to take a few years. I worked with in a lot of healthcare advocacy, especially around Medicaid. That was back before 2000 there. Worked with a community project in St. Clair County, Michigan, which was basically a way of trying to help the community take control of their healthcare system. And have worked with Ohio Primary Care Association and in other ways with federally qualified health centers before coming to UHCAN, Ohio, where I managed several projects, including Ohio Consumers for Health Coverage, which is a coalition that's working to build a consumer voice across the state of Ohio.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, thank you, thank you. My name's not pronounced the way it's spelled. It's David Mayware. I may wear a hat, I may wear a glove. I was raised in the Catholic tradition in Port Clinton and in Lima. And my mom told us very early when the first grade nun, Sister Mary Patrick, by the way, says David May and stops right there, you just raise your hand because you want her not to have to say what she thinks she's going to say next. I started out in 1970 in Mercer and Auglaize County as a Head Start teacher. I've worked ever since then in the policy field trying to make sure that healthcare and healthcare reform makes sense and that people who are actually the end users of all of the products that come out of the policy-making system are able to use them. We've spent about 4.5 years now trying to make sure that the Affordable Care Act makes sense to the end users. That's not an easy thing, and now we're going to have other challenges piled on top of that. So I don't really envy those of you who work at the ground level in the community because resources are going to get tighter. The fact that you're in this room today for $7,500 spread over 2 years means that you know how tight the resources are. But you're also here because you know that a small pool of money can help you get to where you want to go, and that's a really critical understanding that has to happen in the community and at the community level. So I'm really glad that you're here today, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity to share some information with you. I'm going to review the agenda. You have that in your packet. Can I turn this off?
Well, I'm not sure if everyone can hear you.
No, I
Can
mean,
everybody hear him if he doesn't have that second mic on?
can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Is there anybody who can't hear me? All right. I see some people in the room who are my age, so I'm going to believe that if you don't raise your hand when I ask the question, can you hear me, that you can hear me. Say it again? Ah, thank you. I'm going to like you. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to take you through about 3 sessions of work on how to build the groundwork in your community. Now, you all filled out a survey, or many of you filled out a survey and said how long you've been doing this work and whether you've done a SWOT analysis and whether you've done community work. And many of you have done that. So some of this may be a reiteration of what you already know. What I'd really invite you to do is just kind of relax for a couple hours and see if some of this stuff offers you new perspective. When you get a chance to sit in a room for a couple of hours, you often also have the time to kind of like grind out what it is that you're actually going to do with that $7,500. So be with us in the moment. If you have done this work and we're saying something about how to build community or how to build coalitions or how to get a community-driven project going that doesn't make any sense to you, or that you've tried it and it just absolutely blew up in your face, or you tried it and it was absolutely perfect, tell us that too. I mean, it's really critical for us working at the State House and down in Columbus to know what are the things that are working or not working at the community level. So we're going to spend some time laying the groundwork. How do you build your organizational planning team? We're going to take some time to talk about how do you transition from the internal team, which you all in this room are, by the way, to a community-driven team. And then we're going to spend some time talking about action planning. What are the steps that need to be taken to get you to the work that you need to do, and then we're going to wrap up. So here are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. First of all, because of the work that I've done over the years, I know that community work is messy. It's really, really messy. And it gets even more messy when somebody comes to you and says, no, why don't you add some other partners into the mix? If you've lived in a community long enough, you probably know who those partners are. You probably know who you should stay away from and who you should try to draw in. You might have even tried to draw in the ones you should draw in the past and not had very much luck about that. But trust Kathleen and I when we both say that we've done this work for a long time and we recognize that what you're about to step into, or you have stepped into, it's a messy kind of work. There are egos, there are agendas, there are conflicting mission statements, there are political agendas that are behind some of the stuff that keeps you from doing what you want to do. We also know about the intersection between Process Parkway and Content Corners. Now, Process Parkway is that place where people go when they want to think through how they're going to take the next step. They're going to have a meeting to figure out how they're going to take the next step. They're going to have a meeting to figure out whether the meeting worked. They're going to assess the meeting. They're going to evaluate the meeting. And for most of you right now who are the Content Corners folks, you're all like blown out of your chairs. It's like, that's about 5 meetings too many for me. So I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Well, the important part about Content Corners is that's where the baseline lives. And that's data-driven, and that's the research that needs to be done. Those are the questionnaires that you ask in the community. The community needs assessments that you have to do in order to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. So we understand that what we're trying to do here today is to really get you to see the intersection between those two places and find the dynamic energy that can be used at that intersection to help you do the work that you're going to be doing next. So today our work is going to flow in and out of those two areas. It's going to flow in and out of process and content. I've done enough strategic planning with groups to know that when you move between those two areas in a room where you have very heavily content-oriented people who walked in the room knowing exactly what the decision is, and nobody should question the decision. Has anybody had a meeting with that kind of person? Oh, be brave, because I have. I've also had a meeting. I'm a process person. You could tell that by now. I mean, Kathleen is our content person, I'm the process person. So you can probably tell that by now, by the amount of words that I've been using over the past few minutes while the same slide is up on the screen. When is that guy ever going to be done, for crying out loud? That's what I do. That's what I do. And it's important to have both of those at the table at the same time. But I also recognize that when you throw those two groups of people into the room at the same time, you end up with kind of a foggy place sometimes. And it's hard to figure out what's going to happen next. So I want you to just bear with us today while we go through this. We also have some thoughts about how to make community-developed projects successful. So these are ideas that come up from our experience. And I want you also to know that if you have a technical question, if we say something up here and you go, I don't know how that matches with what is being asked for in the RFP that I'm reading speedily while I'm sitting here at the table. We're going to turn that one over to Christine, right? Okay. Oh, that's me. So here's something that I would like for you to do. This may be the easiest thing that you do today. I want you to go to slide 5. starting a community-driven project. And if you would start with a pen in your hand, I love it when people make instructions easy. With a pen in your hand, write number one by how was the issue identified? See, how was the issue identified there? See that? Yeah? Does anybody not see how was the issue identified? Write number one there. And then just write 2, 3, 4, 5 next to the rest of the things, because what we're going to do for a few minutes here is we're going to get you to talk together at the table and to have a conversation about these questions. So, what I'd like for you to do, this table here, is to take question number one. How was the issue identified? I want you to take who was involved. I want you to take who was in charge. Got it? Okay. You to take what was the planning process like. Man, you're good. You guys take what happened when you went from planning to implementation. How was success evaluated? How were the challenges recognized and addressed? And what was the actual outcome? So what I'd like you to do in about 5 minutes is have a conversation with each other about that question from your community perspective. Many of you in the room have been through this process before, have tried to get something started, and have had some crumb break it down. Or, I love Christine's example, the project director died. I mean, things change. And trust me, ladies and gentlemen, over the next 4 years, things are going to change so fast that we won't even be able to figure out what happened next. So imagine yourself back at the beginning of a project that you did when you were trying to figure out, what are we trying to do here? And look at those questions. And then as you went along, how did we evaluate it? How did we assess success? What was the outcome? So you all know what your questions are, right? Okay. So take about 5 minutes and have a conversation amongst yourself. One last thing, I'd like for somebody to be identified as the reporter. That person will stand up and say, our table thought this about that question. Okay? Go. So would table number one give us your, how was the issue identified?
So we discussed,
You have to talk.
can you hear me?
Say it again. Oh, sorry.
How issues are identified from our experience. We talked about both internal and external. And internal can be from our constituents or our clients, that anecdotally they bring issues to our attention. We also talked about our staff recognizing issues and bringing those to the forefront. That these can be intentional, recognizing trends, or accidental. You have a project going on, it's been going on for a while, and all of a sudden the results are changing. What you've planned and have been doing is no longer you're getting the results that you wanted. We talked about external issues and identifiers. One of those being existing data, going to the sources where you usually go that pertain to your services, and what's the data telling you. And then interfacing with members of your community, and that being businesses, organizations, where they are giving feedback on issues that are affecting their ability to perform services or do what they do in the community. And specifically, one of the examples was workforce development seems to be continuing coming up, where businesses are talking about not finding qualified workers or workers that can pass drug tests.
Great, thank you. Second question, who was involved? One thing before you start, when you get this microphone, it doesn't go up there, you know that. It goes to that camera there, so project a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a really soft voice.
Yeah, come on up.
No, I don't. I just want to sit here. Okay, so based on the issue, who you're going to go to for your group
Keep talking.
It-
Okay. Sorry.
can vary according to whatever the issue is, and really can vary. So we found the question a little difficult to put our hands around exactly, but the kind of people that we usually work with when we're trying to find out what the issues are in the community and how to address them would be school administrators, members of church groups, people who are already active, who are maybe already working with the food banks or already out doing home health visits, this kind of thing. So community members, some of the best information is going to come directly from the community. Health agencies like hospitals, family service organizations, and then your more traditional United Way or Red Cross, the police, the fire department, Chamber of Commerce, just roughly. That's what we came up with.
Thank you. Oh, the question was who was in charge? Who was in charge? You think that was you guys back there?
Hi. I wanted to just share a few thoughts from our table here, and we sort of focused on volunteer projects maybe we've been involved with in the past. Obviously, it's really important and essential to any project to have the right person. And sometimes you get the person that volunteers, right? So that fit may not always be apparent at first. But if they're into it and they're passionate about it, you can probably deal with it. The time for that person to volunteer may be limited because they're probably the same person that says yes to everything, right? They're overachieving at their job, they're probably coaching softball in the evenings, and you need to have that kind of a go-to person leading your team. Usually it's a natural born leader, but one of the cautions our group recognized is that you have to make sure the person doesn't get too ingrained in their own thought and get too parochial in their own beliefs, because their goal really is to pull out the best ideas from your team, right, and move you forward. Also, it's sometimes interesting to recognize the different personalities around the table, and as you talked about the processors and the leaders and the content people, different parts of the project will require different skills and abilities to come out. So that natural born leader has to recognize that and really be able to ask someone to step up or ask them to volunteer if they know they're really good at something. One of the things that can happen in a project at the beginning is everyone's really excited, right? You're all getting together and wow, this is the coolest thing we ever saw. But what can happen at some point is people become a little more apathetic and they're not showing up at meetings or they're not turning in the work that needs to be done. So the leader also needs to keep this group engaged. And it's finding things for people to do or recognizing little things that someone contributed, even if you don't think it's really a big deal, it may make all the difference in the world. It's keeping that energy alive. And then also along with that is adjusting your group as you go along. Recognizing that someone maybe doesn't have the time to contribute right now doesn't make them a loser. It means that somebody else is going to have to step up, because that is a cyclical part of being in a volunteer team. And then finally at the end, I think one of the most important things is, even though we like to get things done, we all also get to know each other pretty well, and then we start talking about all the little personal things, and oh, this happened to you, and pretty soon you're off task. So you need to really ask that your manager or your leader keep the group focused, and if they need help to do that, they should be able to ask someone to keep a track of time, or would you mind taking notes so I can keep this thing moving forward. So I don't think the leadership role belongs to one person. And I think that's what we all kind of decided here in the group. It's always changing, so pay attention.
Great, thanks so much. Next question was, what was the planning process like?
We decided that the planning process can kind of go a couple different ways, and if change is really needed and it's understood that it's needed in the community or with the organization, people are very positive and enthusiastic about it. However, on the other side, it can also create a stressful environment when there's multiple agencies trying to work together, and you're trying to work around the different agencies' goals or just issues with planning and reporting in the different agencies or meeting times. Something works different for every agency involved, so it can kind of be really stressful to work around that and find a common meeting ground.
Right, thank you. What happened when you went from planning to implementation?
We found that there was a lot of
Speak this way, please.
oh, okay, sorry. There was a lot of situations in which we would come together as community coalitions, stakeholders, and come together with great ideas, and we'd think that that was a good idea, and the community, we felt like that would be a good idea because we're part of the members of the community, but then when we actually went to implement, then the community wasn't participating in it, and even though there were lots of ideas across the board and lots of stakeholders giving ideas that that was a good idea, we didn't have enough community input to actually move forward with it because the community members weren't coming to what we were planning, and so that we felt like that was a discord, and figure out ways to get more community members involved, and kind of like some of the other groups that said, the overcommitment of volunteers and difficulty of your own personal life. Even if you just want to participate in things, it's hard to get out of your typical pigeonholed activities that you're doing to engage in a new activity that somebody is doing, even though it's a really good idea, unless you're a real champion for that idea.
Thank you. How was success evaluated? I'm fooling you every...
Hi. So we talked about, typically a first step is what I call counting. So counting activities, counting participants. But what I'm really hearing from HealthPath is that you're looking also for some attempts to see results, not just participation levels, but are we moving the needle on health issues? So we talked about ways people had tried to do that. Some people were involved in a tobacco cessation program where participants went through a class, but then there was also an attempt to measure, did you make a commitment to stop smoking, and 3 months later, are you still not smoking? So, the caveat is it is self-report, no one's testing anyone, but it's an attempt to at least see, was there an impact, was there a long-term result? We talked about participation, our participant satisfaction questionnaires. So did you learn? Did you think it was a good program? We talked about parental observation. If the target population is kids, you can ask parents, are they eating more healthy snacks? Are they watching less TV? Are they being more active? Also, education programs sometimes do a pre and a post test. So what do you know about healthy eating, and then you go through an educational experience and do either the same test or a modified, where you can show that participants have learned something they didn't know as a result. And finally, behavior change. So another thing that we've seen or that we talked about was, again, healthy eating, people keeping food diaries, sometimes incentivizing participants. Like if you keep a food diary, you have an activity where people analyze and see have they made changes, and then maybe they get a $10 Kroger's gift card for doing the activity. So you can incentivize people to do some of that work and analysis, and hopefully it leads to change. So those are some things we talked about.
Thank you.
And just to quickly clarify what we're looking for your measures of success, we don't expect you to necessarily move the needle in 2 years. We're looking to move the needle across our entire portfolio over the next 5 years. So we do understand that, like Brad had pointed out earlier, it's hard to move the needle a lot in a 2-year project. So sometimes all you can measure is counts of people. But if you can pull up, well, this many people said they were going to start eating healthier, or this many people said they were going to do this, we'd count that as well. So we look for a blend of both the quantitative and qualitative measures and the long-term, short-term outcomes, outputs, all of that stuff. So we're not expecting you to move the needle very far in 2 years, just so you know. Just make some progress.
Thank you. That was really well done. So I think you're over here. How were the challenges recognized and addressed? I apologize.
Uh-oh. Okay, one of the things that we obviously had talked about is the challenges recognized and addressed. I think it's really important to pre-plan a little bit, be ahead of the game in your pre-planning period where, hey, here are some of our challenges that we could face, somebody passing away, changing of hands, things like that, and really stay focused on the task at hand. So if you already have some of those with your community members, with your staff, with even your patients or whatever you're kind of dealing with, of those challenges that you may expect that may come up, you might have an easier way to roll with the punches. So obviously if you're in, I don't know if all of you are in something similar to what my job position is, but when you deal with volunteers, a lot of times you do have to roll with punches. So being uptight and making sure that things go exactly how they are going to go is not necessarily going to happen. So I think it's really important that we are ahead of the game. Obviously, there are some things that going to happen that we don't know, weren't expecting. But again, you know, as a group, as community members are involved, everybody has an opinion and can come in and tackle that challenge together.
Great, thanks. And finally, what was the actual outcome?
We decided as a group that actual outcome doesn't always come as you first intended it. And it kind of more turned into a discussion about all of the challenges that come across when you are doing a community-based project. In my case, there were too many organizations, and we had too many goals and objectives, and we didn't just focus on one, and really didn't end up having anything come of it. Some of us had political agendas, and we're also working with too many people, so that actual outcome wasn't what we expected.
Thank you. So, Christine, will there be a list of the people who are here today that gets sent out to everybody who's here today by any chance?
Is there what?
A list of people who are here today that gets sent out to everybody who's here today?
We don't typically share the list of participants, but if you guys want us to do that, we can do that. But it's not our usual practice to send out the list to everybody.
Okay.
We can if you want it. And I didn't cover that in my slides, and I should have, because I wrote this huge paragraph in the RFP about it. Your community is what you define it to be. We're not going to tell you what your community is. You need to define that for us. So if it's a single school building, if it's smokers, if it's older adults in this particular town or city, if it's a club, a 4-H club, a Girl Scout troop, who is your community? You tell us. We're not going to tell you. So you guys need to define who your community is. And remember, the smaller and the more local is probably better, because you're not going to be able to do a whole lot with $7,500 in an entire county unless you're in a really small population county. So you guys define who your community is, and there's a whole question on the proposal for that.
Great, thank you. There you go. So sometimes in the work that I did at the community level, there seemed to be this person who would take control of everything and try to get something done based on the backs of a lot of different people. And it really didn't look much like community-oriented. So I wanted to reiterate just a couple phrases that Christine gave earlier. Resident input, designed by residents, community-driven and community-led. Those are critical pieces for you to think about. And bonus question, when is the luncheon in 2017? Who said that? Very good. And what month is the project fair in 2018? And just in case you didn't know, this is the time when we've designed just for you to lose the weight that you gained on Thursday, and that's why the room is like it is. So I've got a couple more pieces that I'm going to do, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. I will get this. We're going to be talking about 3 types of groups of people. In my mind, this kind of stuff typically gets moving because there is an early planning team. That may be 3 to 5 people. It may be the people who came with you today. Who came with colleagues today? Could you raise your hand? Who came alone? Okay. Those of you who came alone, do you have somebody back at home that you're going to be able to pull together as soon as you get back to start working on this thing? Good. So there's a key planning team. We're also going to be talking about key partners. Who do you add to the planning team as you go along? And then we're going to be talking a little bit about how to build a coalition. Now, Christine has said to me that it's not important to HealthPath Foundation that we show you or teach you how to create a coalition. We're going to speak from our own perspectives on that. You may end up with a coalition at your local level, or you may not. That's not the intent here. Part of the reason we want to talk about this today is to make sure that you have heard from our own experiences what works in a community and in a coalition and what doesn't. So, there are a couple things that you need to do in the very early phases, which include the work that you're going to be doing in some kind of planning sessions, and that is to begin thinking about what's going on in the community. What is happening at the community level? And many times we call this an environmental scan, and in your packet, at the back you'll see a set of sheets that look like this. It's the SWOT analysis that you have in your packets. How many of you have been involved in a SWOT analysis in the past? Can you raise your hand? Good. Because there may be other people who are going to be calling you on the phone and saying, what? I actually worked with a group of people who didn't want to use the word SWOT because it sounded too much like spanking. They wanted to change the word. And I was like, no, we can't do that. It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We can't change the thing. That's what we're going to do. But, you know, every once in a while the planning process gets a little weird. So I want you to look at this piece of paper for a second because it takes a different approach to the process of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. For those of you who have done this before, you know that strengths and weaknesses are where we are right now. That's the present. What can lead us forward and what can keep us from doing what we need to do right now in this moment? Those are our strengths and weaknesses. What we do with this form is to be in making you take the next step. So you have a strength in terms of the staff. The staff are our strengths, or our volunteers are our strengths, or our credibility in the community is our strength. You have to take it to the next step in the planning process. You have to really ask yourself, so what can we do to enhance the positive aspects of our organization? What can we do to minimize the threats? So when you're doing the SWOT analysis in the community, don't let yourself get away with, oh, we got a great staff. That's really important. But what are you going to do to make sure that they don't burn out, that they don't go away, that you don't lose them? Or, I love this one back here, you have to keep them fired up. Some of the work that we do takes a really long time to do. Is that not correct? And as a result of that, and sometimes between benchmarks, there's a long time. And it's really critical to make sure that there's some M&Ms in the room when you get between one benchmark and another benchmark. There has to be some win in the room that's happening to make sure that people continue to be engaged. So take a look at the next page. It's the weaknesses. What can we do to overcome those weaknesses? Now, I want to take you back just for a second. The process that I'm talking about right now can really be done with the early planning team. That's that group of people that you've got back in your community to have this conversation with. This is an initial conversation. The second level that you want to go to then, what are the opportunities and threats? Opportunities and threats are future. What are the things that may be coming at us that can help us do our job a little bit better? What are the things that are coming at us that are going to stop us from doing our job? And this is the point at which you really have to do some crystal balling. This is important work that we do. This is the stuff that wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. when you've got a project, you know it's moving in the right direction, and all of a sudden you just go, oh crap, somebody just moved. The bank president just got transferred. The guy that I was going to put my thumb on, who runs a corporation in town, looks like he's getting out of town. The whole thing's going away. Those are threats. But they might also be opportunities. So you really have to drag yourself out there and begin thinking about what can you do to maximize the benefit for your organization, or what can you do to minimize the threat that's out there. Again, this is the early planning team conversation. So I hope that this particular bits and pieces of paper are helpful to you, because it really makes you think beyond just the question of what's a strength to the next question. So use that in your group to engage them and to keep the conversation going. As we talked, in that first conversation that you're having, that's the planning team group, you're going to begin starting to think about who should we add to the table. What people should we bring into the conversation that are not going to overwhelm us, but are not going to take us off track? Somebody else said you really have to make sure that you find some people who will keep you on track. That's a really critical question for yourselves at this very early stage. So you have to have a discussion in that first planning session about who are the key partners that you want to add. And then that group of people, that group of key partners, you, the early planning team, begins the outreach to the key partners. You go out into the community and you begin saying, hey, look here. You know about us, you know what we do, you've liked what we do for a long time. I'd like to sit with you for a while and I'd like to talk with you about the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats that we've identified. And see if these make sense to you. Do these resonate with you? Are these issues that you see important in the community? Are these problems? Could this be an opportunity? This is a threat. Do you see a way of making it an opportunity? And that's a way of bringing people into the next level of the planning process that we're going to talk about more in a little while.
So I want to talk a little bit about leadership styles. And before that, wait a minute. Sorry. When we talk about leadership, there's really, I think, two big categories to think about. One, you need someone who will shepherd the process. You know, the person who will call the meetings, send out an agenda, make sure notes have been taken, that notes get sent out, that sort of process. If you don't have that, it's very possible that, you know, there could be a lot of charisma in the room, but things could just fall flat because no one can remember what they said they were going to do and all of those kinds of things. So that's kind of a process leader. But then there's more like the person who really, excuse me, I said that's like a management leader, but then there's the person who really moves the process. And so there's some different styles. I mean, I'm sure that you could come up with some of your own. I like these from Daniel Goleman. I'm just going to kind of read them real quick, and then I'm going to ask you to give some examples for me. So there's the pace-setting leader, the one who says, do as I do, now. And then there's the authoritative leader who says, come with me. There's an affiliative leader who says, people come first. Like, what do you guys want to do? You know. Then there is the coaching leader. Try this. The coercive leader, do what I tell you. And then the democratic leader, what do you think? So let's go back. The pace-setting leader. Anybody have an example of what that might be, or can think of the kind of either a profession or a person or a community effort that you've seen happen where there is someone who's a pace-setting leader? Yes? It reminds me of how you see Steve Jobs portrayed, like his driving, passionate, pace-setting. Okay, so the suggestion is that Steve Jobs was a pace-setting leader because of the way he went about bringing folks along on his vision. What about an authoritative leader? Come with me. Any thoughts on who or what kind of profession or example anybody might have? Yeah.
As a nonpartisan organization, I tried to stay away from the leaders that have been most in our minds the last couple months or like 2 years. But that's an interesting example. Another one that you might, in some cases, I think is when people are doing campaigns and the campaign has all been kind of set out as to what's going to happen, and then it's kind of a come with me. Sometimes I think union leaders might do that. And it's not, authoritative isn't necessarily negative, it's just, you know, people, they have an idea, they're supposed to make it happen, and they move forward on it. On the pace-setting leader, another one that came to mind for me was, we have a project, actually it's a national project, but I don't know how far it's gone within Ohio, but in Columbus, it's called Walk with a Doc. And every Saturday morning in certain neighborhoods, there will be a healthcare professional who will join with the health department, and people come to walk and they walk with them. And so nobody starts walking until the doc or the other professional gets there. And then he or she talks a little bit about the topic, you know, what they do. And then they start walking. And then it's kind of like they're setting the pace, and people walk along and try to get next to the professional so they can ask those questions that they can't ask their own doctor. So, and then what about the coaching leader? What's a example of that? Any thoughts? I mean, actually, I think it is a coach. It's what we call the coach. It's, you know, it's the people who are at the, you know, the baseball, with the baseball team or the football team or whatever, and kind of watching how people do it. They have an idea in their mind of how it should be done, and then as they see the person trying and maybe not quite achieving, they say, here, try this. What about the coercive leader? Do what I tell you. Any examples of that? I mean, I guess there I would kind of think of the military. You know, I mean, that's one place where, you know, lives are at stake, and you can't have a very democratic battlefield with people trying to figure it out there. And so you need to have a certain kind of order that's understood by everybody, and that leader imparts that order. So anyway, that's something to think about. One of the things also with leaders is that there's a lot of leadership, and there needs to be shared leadership. There's not necessarily a person in the group who owns everything. They may be the person that's been designated the leader, and in fact they have some of the skills that we just talked about, and they're good at getting other people to move forward, inspiring people to, you know, they have a lot of passion, a lot of energy, vision. But, you know, there's, just as we talked about the affiliate or the democratic leader, what do you think? Sometimes the leader is a person who really does a lot of pushing, but maybe somebody in the group has the wisdom to say, hold on, I don't think we're ready to move yet, because I've been sitting here for the last 30 minutes and I've been noticing this or that or the other that's been happening in the group, and I think we have to attend to that before we can really move forward. So the person who interrupted and made that observation is exercising leadership. So it's just, I'm sure there's lots of ideas. You've been, you know, you've all been around the block many, many times, and so there's probably many ways that you've seen leadership both be demonstrated, and in the absence of leadership, sometimes also being demonstrated, and projects not going quite the way they were intended to go. Now, I want to talk a little bit about inclusion, diversity, and equity, and I want to take more than a minute here. I really want to think about this. Because my experience has been, and I think the experience of David and other people that we've worked with, has been that more people trip up in this area of work, and more projects don't work right because people didn't quite get what diversity and inclusion is all about. So if you think about diversity, okay, so there's variation. Like, is there diversity in this room? Well, it depends on what you mean. I don't know who's the youngest person, trying to think of who looks really young. But there's probably somebody who's, at least some of you are still in your 20s and your 30s. And then some of us have hit 60, or even worse, Medicare age. So I'd say there is diversity in this room. But if you looked at gender diversity, well, there's a gentleman there, and there, and there, and there. But in a sense, we're probably at about 80% female in this room. I would just kind of guess. Maybe that's not quite right. What about persons of color? I know there's at least one person of color in the room. There may be others because I don't have a real clear view. But I would say probably in that way we're not really diverse. And some of that, there's lots of reasons that could be. Geography, well, we specifically are having this event here to be geographically convenient to people in this area who will be writing a grant proposal. So we're not real geographically diverse, but then that's not necessarily needed. If you think about inclusive, diverse is not the same as inclusive. Diverse means, as we just said, there is diversity. There are some people who are young, there's some people who are old, there are persons of color, there are persons not of color. So all sorts of ways to be diverse. But what about inclusive? That means that everybody's at the table that should be at the table, who has something to say about us. I think if any of you work within the disability community, you're familiar with the sentence, "Nothing about us without us." And that's really something that should go well beyond persons with disabilities. In any community setting, it should be nothing about us without us. And I'll just tell you a little story about some work that I was involved in. And about 5 years ago, there was an issue on the ballot which was supposed to create in the state some real stops, some real barriers to requiring anyone to do anything as far as healthcare was concerned. And the whole idea is that this constitutional amendment proposal emerged after the Affordable Care Act was passed, and a number of people were unhappy and were trying to stop it, particularly people who, felt that it was really an infringement on rights, and who really weren't looking at it so much in terms of whether people had health care or not, or needed it or not, but rather no one should be able to tell me what I have to do. So as this issue was proceeding forward, it was called Issue 3. There was a group of us from different organizations, and we were all talking about how to stop Issue 3. And none of us had any budgets to do it. For those of us who were 501c3s, we could work on it, but we had to be careful because there were certain things we could do and certain things we couldn't do. And then as we got farther and farther down the road, and it's getting closer to the election, and we're not having the kind of success we had hoped, and we're not raising the kind of money we had hoped, we say, we need to bring more African American people into this. There's so much at stake for that community. We need to bring the faith community also. There's so much at stake for their congregations. And kind of look around the room, and it's like about 8 or 9 people in the room who have been meeting together for months, and everyone is white in this room. And so here we were, having gotten that far down the road, and yet we're then trying to think about, we really should have people of color at this table, but we weren't thinking that way. So I bring this up now because as we talk about pulling groups together, what's really important for all of you to think about is what's the issue that you're going to work on? Who are the stakeholders? Who, the nothing without us about us, who are those people that you want to make sure are having input into what's going to be happening in this project that you're going to try to get community input for. Just one other example that I sometimes think about, an area that I think is a blind spot that I've had, and I'll bet you've had the same blind spot. In Ohio, we don't really have a lot of tribes. There's not a lot of Native Americans in Ohio. And I have this, but there are some, you know, not a lot, but there are tribes, and they are in a number of places in our state. And so I have found over the years, every time I get a new set of regulations to review or a new anything to look at, as soon as I get to the part that says, this pertains to the American Indian tribes, etc., I say, that's New Mexico, that's Arizona, that's Montana. And so it's just a recognition, because this is a very sensitive area now in our country, extremely. But we have a lot of people among us, some groups which may actually seem rather small, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be included. So this idea of being inclusive is just one you really got to think about and work on. And I guess the last thing I want to say here is that equity is not the same thing as equality. Equity is something very important to work for, so is equality. But they have different functions at different times. So if, let's just kind of, I didn't put the picture in, but just sort of imagine, if you will, a fence, and you have three people, and there's someone who's short, and someone who's medium high, and someone who's tall. And none of them can see over the fence. So you bring them each a stool, and you bring them each a 10-inch stool. Well, for the person who's tall, that might get them over so they can see, but what about the person who's medium-sized or the person who's very small? What you really need to do is have a stool that meets the needs of each of those three people so that all of them are able to look over the fence. Now, sometimes what you want to do in a situation is not necessarily bring the stool. Maybe you should have a lower fence or a hole, some holes in the fence that people can look through. So it takes some real thinking about how do we create our project in a way that's equitable. And I just want to take just a minute to ask if any of you have any thoughts on this, or really, shared one of my experiences. If any of you have experiences that you would care to share that might help other people in the room learn as we start, moving forward on a community project. Well, then what I would like to do is just take 3 minutes, and because sometimes it's easier to talk about these things in a little group than in a big group. So just take 3 minutes and talk to your neighbors at your table as to whether there's anything that any of them can remember or think of that would be helpful to others, and then I'll check back with you in 3 minutes. Let me just ask, looking at this table over, first one, to my right, yeah, you guys, anything interesting any insights that you want to share? You don't have to, but anything you'd like to share? She's bringing the mic, yeah.
Just a comment, and I hope it doesn't come across as pedantic, but we do want to understand the difference between diversity and representativeness. The 3 counties that I represent, when we look at it from a racial demographics, it's like 96% white. Mm-hmm. And so to be diverse and include people simply based on their racial profile is to upset the representativeness of the overall population. So our focus is on inclusiveness based on their relationship to the services that we provide. We are mandated to have members of our boards who are consumers of services, who are family members of consumers of services, who are practitioners, and so on. So by focusing on the practice rather than on the demographic, I think we're more inclusive, even if we're not as diverse from a demographic standpoint.
I think that one thing we need to all keep in mind is that even if a percentage of people in a county is very small, they are still there. So it would probably not, be, and also sometimes, going back to the example you were just giving, sometimes it's about bringing more people into the group from whom you are drawing. So if it's, let's say it's a community health center, and you said, there are no persons of color here in our health center, so our board doesn't happen to reflect that. Well, then the question would be, well, why are there not any persons of color? Are you doing things in a culturally competent way, et cetera, et cetera? So it's just, there's always that kind of next thing to kind of, or like another layer of the onion to peel back. So thank you. Anybody at that table have anything you want to add? Okay, back there. Yeah, gentleman in the blue shirt and the green sweater and the print. And oh, here we got somebody. Okay, go ahead.
So this is a really kind of obvious example, but we were recently putting together kind of a promotional video to encourage people to come out and volunteer. And it was 5 minutes long. It was beautifully done. We had a professional videographer come in and do it. And, you know, we spent an entire weekend putting it together. And then our board watched it, and then they identified that in the video there was no one under the age of 45, and there were only Caucasians in the video. And none of us had noticed it. It had been this kind of labor of love all weekend long. And, you know, so thinking about those things, I think beforehand is really important, even if I don't want to use the word tacky, but that's the only word I can think of, like thinking about it in those terms beforehand and how it'll look to the volunteers you're trying to recruit, or in a case like this, the grant committee, and just really thinking about it strategically before you go out and do things, I think is
that's a great example. Yeah. One more comment, and then we'll have to move along. Yes.
Kind of related to what the gentleman in the front had mentioned before, but trying to avoid tokenism when you're including people from diverse communities in your project planning. You want to have relationships with people and communities throughout the year so that you're not just approaching people at grant time and being like, hey, I know I've never met you before, but we would really love to get this grant, so could you be on our collaboration team? But also recognizing that, even if you have built those relationships, a single person of color, for example, on a planning team cannot possibly speak for the experiences of every person of color in the community, just as I can't, as a white 40-year-old glasses-wearing woman, speak for every 40-year-old white glasses-wearing woman out there. So just respecting that we can't place too much responsibility on the shoulders of any one individual on the planning team in terms of representing a particular demographic.
Yeah, and for those who maybe didn't hear it, I can't repeat it all, but just briefly, we have to avoid tokenism. And we can't expect one person from a minority group to represent all the people in that group. And we can't just try to pull people in when we need them for something, like to write a grant. These are relationships, they have to be built ongoing all the time in your work. So thank you. I'm glad that these are really insightful comments. Thank you for sharing among each other. And I'm now going to turn it back to David, and he will take you back into the planning process.
We're going to go through this process, and then we're going to take a break because the energy in the room indicates that would be necessary. I ran a community action agency, and part of the responsibility from the federal agency was to have representation from the community on our board. We also had to have 1/3 elected officials and 1/3 business people as part of the board. What I saw from that was that as new low-income folks came onto the board, there really needed to be a mentoring relationship with them to make sure that they understood that their role was now representative of the community. We actually had elections where low-income folks were elected to the board, so it wasn't just us going out and picking people, but the low-income community came together and chose the folks who were coming to the board. But even at that, those folks still needed time and education and mentoring to help get to the point where they could bring their full voice to the table. So those are some things that we need to think about as well. I want to talk just a little bit more about the planning process. There are two things that can happen after the first session where you have your key partners together and you've done your SWOT analysis and you've gone out into the community. You begin figuring out who it is that could be brought into the larger picture, larger conversation. This is also the place where you begin taking what you've generated from the SWOT analysis and boiling it down to a few of the issues. One of the points that was made in this room earlier is that we can't do everything for everybody. Oftentimes, that's what we try to do. We try to do everything in the community that's set out in front of us, and we can't. We have to pick a few of the issues, the critical issues that need to be taken care of. But in this process, in this planning process, what I want to encourage you to do is that each time you go through a conversation and move either the SWOTs that you found or the key issues you found, move it back out into the community. Have the partners, have both the key partners and now the planning team working together to figure out who in the community you can go back out to and have a conversation with them, just as I did over here. Here are the things that we've found that are important to us. What are you thinking about this? Here is the key partner group. Who are we missing that could be added to a larger planning group that could come together and make sure that this thing is effective and works well? So I want you just to take some time when you get out of here and think about this in terms of the work that you're going to be doing in your community. And you might find some use that you can make of putting together several planning sessions that builds from the small planning group that you've got here to the key partners to a fuller group of people who are going to be working on this. There are plenty of tools that you can use in this process. Some of them have to do with community surveys, where you're asking a whole group of people questions about what is going on with them and how they can be helpful. Your partner members can help with that survey, because trust me, I know that surveys don't come without some amount of money that they cost, both to do and to look through, to analyze. One of the really effective ways of making sure that you're getting out into the community and bringing information back to the planning process is to use house meetings. We use these really effectively in the Franklin County area to begin thinking about what are the key issues in the community. And so I've seen small house meetings generate immense amount of energy that can be used to help move the planning process forward. And then also, I'm sure you use these, but community meetings to help you generate interest as well as a better understanding of what your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats have indicated to you. I want Kathleen now to talk a little bit more about building the coalition in the community.
Okay. So yeah, just like a little bit about coalitions. As I think Christina had already said, that you're not, for this work, you're not being asked to put together a coalition. But there may be coalitions around where you would, that you're part of, or that you would draw some of your partners from. So I think it's important to just have an understanding of how this flows on the continuum, as you have the early planning team, and then a team that has some of your few key partners, and then actually moving to build a coalition. And the coalition is basically a group, usually of organizations, sometimes of people, that come together to use their resources and their energy to solve a problem or to accomplish something. Usually there's a more formal organizational structure with a coalition than simply with a small group. And there is usually a decision-making model as to how the planning will be done and how key partners will be involved. So there's really, I have found two main things that bring coalitions together. But I'm sure there's others you might want to suggest, but a problem that needs to be addressed, or there's an opportunity that you want to take advantage of. So here, you're kind of here in the opportunity stage. You want to write a grant for something that you want to do. But the idea would be to bring people together and look at, what is the problem, or is, what is the opportunity. Sometimes, as I mentioned, there might already be a coalition in place. And you might say, well, maybe this could really be a good fit with this coalition or that. We have this, dental coalition, dental access coalition, or we have another coalition that's been together that deals with elders in our community. You know, maybe we can see if they want to be, you know, part of this, and we can be part of their effort. And then I think it's just going to depend on a couple of things whether that can work or not. One is it depends on what kind of rules the coalition has for expanding its work and what its actual mission is, because the coalition might be willing to get involved in this, and maybe somebody will think, oh, there might be a few dollars in this for me, but you know, you really want to make sure that if you're exploring a project with an already in place coalition, that you're really clear about what their mission is, what kind of approach they have, what kind of decision-making process they have for doing work, and whether your work and what they're doing could really function together or not. I think the other thing also comes down to, are the right people at the table? You know, if the coalition is focusing on something, but there just are more people that really need to be at the table for what you want to do, then there's really got to be a discussion as to whether the coalition would be open to that idea of bringing in new members. And just also, what are its operating principles? So when you're thinking about really, whether it's building your key partner group or building a coalition, you need to think about, who do we want at this table? Who would we perhaps not want? So for example, if you're doing something that is, let's say you are really focused and it's something that's kind of anti-business, let's say, you know, then you probably wouldn't ask the Chamber of Commerce to be in the coalition. I mean, just kind of a crazy example, but just trying to give you an idea of some of the extremes. And so when you think about who should be there, first, you want to make sure that the people there all share the common purpose. You want to look at whether they can bring resources to the table, not necessarily money resources, but resources of their organizational commitment, their reputation, their staff, you know, other things that might be associated with that organization. And will bringing a person in add to the inclusiveness and the diversity of our coalition? So these are all kind of things to think about. People you might not want to invite is people who don't really share that common purpose, and people who maybe have a history of not working well with other groups that really need to be at the table. And as you think about this, I think it's really important, and I think this is actually an area that people sometimes get a little bit tripped up on, to have a thoughtful conversation with someone who represents an organization before exactly extending the ask. Sometimes it gets awkward, like, oh, we're starting this new coalition, and I kind of would really like to talk to you. We're trying to kind of build it out. I don't know, do you want to be in our coalition? Well, if you haven't really had the conversation to determine whether it's a good fit, you know, don't ask before you're ready for the answer, okay? So you want to really say, we're doing kind of a broad process here of looking at a lot of different groups who might be willing to work on this, and I can't extend an actual invitation to you right now, but do you have time to have a cup of coffee where we could talk a little more about what we're trying to do and what might be a good fit between your organization and ours? So you just need to be kind of thoughtful about how you do it. You want your coalition, as I said, to be diverse and inclusive. And the other thing is you want to make sure, and this is kind of goes on the inclusiveness and the equity part of this, that all of the diverse demographic groups are sharing power in an equitable way. So again, it goes back to the comment made by one of the individuals up here at this table, is that you aren't looking for tokens, you're looking for people who will contribute and who you are willing to extend power to. And that's just something that just takes time and experience and everything. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move on? Okay. Now, there's another kind of stakeholder, another organization or person who might not actually be a member of your group. They might not even, they might not be the key partner, but they may be an ally. So you say, well, what is an ally? It's someone that has a common interest with another person or organization, and they're willing to support the common interest, okay? And an ally is someone who might not actually be a member of the group, but may be willing to do some things at certain points in time that will be very important. For example, if you were working on a project that involved kids and dental access, you may want to have people from the school there, from the Head Start program. There's a number of them you might want. And then there might be a group of dentists who actually has some things that they could offer. And on the issues you're going to work on, they could be really helpful. But maybe on some issues that you often work on, you kind of butt heads with them. So you can actually have an ally, because if it's very clear as to what areas you agree on, and they have an interest in supporting you as much as you have an interest in them supporting you, then I think that's an ally, and you want to keep that person close and keep them informed of what's going on, so that when it comes time to ask them to do something like testify at a hearing or speak to a group that wields influence in your community on the issue you're working on, they don't feel like, oh, well, I haven't heard anything about you guys for 6 months. What's going on? And so, what I want to do now is sort of set things up for when we come back together after the break. So this is the slide that separates you and the break. Just talk a little bit about vision and mission development. So we know that the vision is like the end state. And there's some papers in your folder. One of them has these orange, it looks like traffic kinds of repair signs, and one says OCHC on it. And these are both documents that are samples. These are some coalitions that we've done work with, and we're kind of using them to just show you how this might be stated. So one of them looks like this, and one of them looks like this. So like on the one with the orange Fix It Now paper, it says Ohio Consumers for Health Coverage is a coalition uniting the consumer voice with the goal of achieving affordable, high-quality health care for all. So that's our vision. We want to achieve affordable, high-quality health care for all. That's an end state. That's not something that you need a lot of steps before you get to that place. And as you think about that end state or that vision, then the mission becomes, well, how will you get there? And so if you look at the other paper that you have nearby that has the little state of Ohio at the top, we talk here about our vision of we need a strong, united consumer voice to make sure reforms meet the needs of all Ohioans. So there we simply are saying consumers, energized, activated, at the table, consulted, inclusive, having that input into the decisions. That's what we want to see. And we have certain principles for healthcare reform that you can see at the bottom. And then if you go over to the second side of that page, it will say approaches to achieving healthcare reform. That's really like our mission. They're strategies, but we said, well, we're going to work with insurance reform. We're going to work with public coverage or subsidies to make coverage affordable. We're going to work toward having shared responsibility. And what that helped us to do as people were, or organizations were being consulted about whether they wanted to be part of the coalition, is that it helped us realize who would be a good fit in the coalition, who might not be. For example, public coverage or subsidies to make coverage affordable. Well, if some people believe only in the private market and the public coverage and the public subsidies are something they're opposed to, well then they couldn't be part of our group because they wouldn't share in that part of the mission. So you look at the vision, you set your vision, you set your mission, and then it's important as you bring your members together to know what they're going to offer you. So if you look also in your folder near these other papers, there's a letter from Acorn. And they sent us that letter when our coalition was coming together in 2007. And they basically laid out why they wanted to be part of this effort and what they could bring to the effort. It's not a kind of affiliation agreement where you actually had both parties signing a memorandum of understanding, but it is a place where they put in writing what they were willing to do, and we were putting in writing what our coalition was going to do, because that writing was part of a grant proposal, and they were all part of helping move that forward. So we are going to take a very short break. How many minutes, Christine? 5? 5-minute break. So if you can just get up and stretch, and if you need to get more snacks, the restrooms are out down that way. Just be back. What time is it now? 3:25. Be back in your chairs, please. Thanks.
Well, we're headed into the home stretch. Thank you for staying with us for the afternoon. We've actually shortened the presentation, so if you look through your slides, you'll notice that we're speeding past some of them. The information is there. Christine has both my and Kathleen's contact information if you want to get in touch with us to ask us any questions about building coalitions or the community planning process. So I'm going to take you through an actual example of a goal that is identified in the request for proposal, and that would be that the number of preschool children who are actively involved in oral self-care is increased. This is about cavity-free kids. This is only one example, so I want you to think about that. What's an objective? An objective is that as a result of the project activities by January 2018, 50% more center-based early childhood development programs like Head Start, preschools, or for-profit or nonprofit preschools will adopt oral self-care activities such as table brushing. Table brushing is an activity that's in the Head Start program. It's a really cool activity where the teachers actually sit with the Head Start children, and on a timed basis, they brush their teeth for 2 minutes. Teachers are brushing their teeth, kids are brushing their teeth, and they're learning that habit. And for many people who have not had oral health care for generations, it may sound strange to you, but the simple habit of brushing one's teeth is not passed on, because mom never got it taught to her, and grandma never got it taught to her. So part of what we have to do is to begin changing those cultural norms that exist within the families. And in the Head Start program, there's a requirement, an oral health requirement that also includes getting the child to a dentist for an assessment within a specific period of time. So Head Start's actually bound by a federal requirement to do this. So if you're beginning to think about who can I partner with in the community, begin looking at the federal regulations or the state regulations that drive the organization that you're trying to partner with. Because you can often find in those regulations a little kernel of a thing that can help you get in the door and help them figure out how they can do what they do better, because now you're here to help them. I want you to think a little bit about an activity. Project Cavity Free Kids will develop and distribute oral self-care materials and provide training for a certain number of center-based daycare providers. That's an activity. When we were talking about outputs before, this is counting. This is the number. This does not change the needle so much as it gives you the number. It's a certain number of things that are going to be happening. An outcome is how the community is changed as a result of the work that you do. This is an output. And outputs are okay, aren't they?
Yes, outputs are great.
Thank you. So, how many people know about this? Because if you know about it, I'm not going to say anything about it. SMART objectives. Raise your, oh, come on, you can get your hands up. It's not that hard. Well, the information is there. I'm going to say just a few things about some of these. When you start thinking about your objective, which is fairly broad, it does have to be specific. You have to figure out what the numbers are. They have to be achievable. This is not dream time, where you're floating amongst the clouds and gathering more clouds together so that when you land on the earth, your landing will be very light. This is about how do you actually do what it is that you're attempting to do. They need to be realistic. What are your resources? What's it going to cost to do it? Do you have the personnel and the time frame to do it? And then they have to be time bound. When will you get it done? When will it be done? And you actually already have some time frames. They're the ones that Christine talked about a little while ago. So that's how short we made it. We're going to talk a little bit about the planning process. In your packet there is a planning form. It's the last thing that's in the packet. You can use it when you're doing your SWOT analysis and you're looking at what are the issues. You can begin using that kind of a planning form to help you figure out who's going to do what and when. But what's really important is this PDSA, and that is that you understand that part of what you're trying to do is do. So the planning process is important, but doing what you say you're going to do is important as well. And then it's important for you as the group to take a step back and look at it. Did you accomplish what it was you were trying to accomplish? And if you didn't, for some reason, the next act you can take is to call Christine on the phone and say, oh my gosh, we said that by this time we were going to have 65 million people on the moon. NASA got defunded. What do we do now? Call her on the phone. Things happen. HealthPath Foundation recognizes that things happen to change what you want to do. She's over here, just in case you can't see her, nodding her head furiously, up and down. Not that way, up and down. So, plan, do it, look at it, and then take some action. And sometimes the action has to be, Hail Mary, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it that way. Something broke, please help me fix it. And she'll actually help you fix it. A lot of experience sitting right over there. In order to do the study, you also have to set up the evaluation process. For those of you who haven't done that before, who has set up evaluation processes in the room? Raise your hand. She's not raising it too high because she knows somebody's going to call her on the phone. That's part of the reason I was asking about, will you all get to know who's in the room? Can you raise your hand if you've set up an evaluation process before? Come on. Now, take a look around. These are the people you should go talk to before you leave the room if you've never done it. Oh my God, what did he just say? If you haven't done it before, seek out someone who has done it, talk with them, and figure out how to make sure that your objective is being evaluated. I think Kathleen is going to be talking a little bit about accountability. So, thank you.
When you're working in a coalition or really in any kind of a group, there has to be some accountability. The accountability is basically a two-way process. The group has to be accountable to the members, and the members have to be accountable to the group, the coalition, to do what they said they were going to do. So let's talk a little bit about coalition accountability. What you want to do is you want to have accountability built into the structure. So, for example, in some groups, tables, networks, things that have come together, There's a decision that the decision maker of the organization should be at the table so that this coalition can act quickly and decisively rather than have people sent and kind of taking notes and talking and then having to go back and check with someone before there can be a vote. That's not always the case, but in some coalitions, that's something that they want, and therefore then that has to be built right into the structure. You want the mission to be clear so that you don't start taking on activities that really weren't part of what you originally came together about. The decision-making process needs to be clear. In the Ohio Consumers for Health coverage, we use consensus with the idea that you have certain levels of agreement. We don't insist on absolute consensus before we move forward, but there's a level where a person can say, I don't agree with this decision, or my organization doesn't agree with this decision, but we aren't going to hold the group up from going ahead. We will simply sit it out and not be active in this. In our coalition, that happens a number of times because we have either statewide groups or local groups that have a national office, and the national office is telling them what they can and can't do, and therefore they sometimes just have to sit it out, but they don't want to stop the group from doing it. And the amount of resources that an organization is expected to provide, whether that's staff time, volunteer time, time spent in meetings, etc., that needs to be clear. So the leadership of the coalition needs to be accountable to the members. Okay, so public state, oh, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting to do this. Yeah, so if the leadership is making a public statement, they need to adhere to the boundaries that the coalition set. If you decided you're going to support the Affordable Care Act, you don't go on beyond it and say, and furthermore, we want to see a single payer system, Medicare for all. That went beyond what the coalition said, therefore the leader who speaks has to stay within the boundaries. Coalition members need to come into the coalition, new members, by an agreed upon procedure. A procedure we use there is simply, if you remember that ACORN letter, where they said what they were going to do anytime now, even though we don't have a Robert Wood Johnson grant anymore to support the coalition, anytime a new person wants to be part of our coalition or new organization, we ask them to send us an email that says why they want to be part of it and what they think they will be able to offer the coalition and what they would expect the coalition to be doing in terms of what some of their parameters are. And coalition members also need to keep their hats straight. That's another part of accountability of the coalition to the members. So if somebody is part of a coalition, in fact, they're even a leader in a coalition, but they also have another area where they do a lot of work. You know, our coalition co-chair in OCHC up until several years ago was also the president of the Democratic Party in the city that he was in. Well, he always had to keep those hats straight so that no one would confuse and think that we were part of the Democratic Party or taking direction from them. So then the members' accountability to the coalition. Okay, so they need to basically attend the meetings or phone meetings, however, you know, at least enough of them to meet the minimum requirements the coalition has set. There needs to be a written record of who said they would do what, and then leadership needs to check in with members to track progress. And there also needs to be some kind of procedure in place to shift unfulfilled commitments. So you don't want to wait for a meeting to say that the ABC organization was going to do this, but now they can't. And is it okay if EDF over here substitutes? You need something that's a little bit more flexible, that it can be worked on in between meetings. So, David, this comes back to you, right? I think we're almost there, folks.
What we've been talking about all day long is commitment. It's how individuals commit. It's how the community commits. It's how you commit to what you're going to do next. I want you to take 5 minutes now. We've got 5 minutes, all right? I want you to take 5 minutes now and address these questions. These are really critical questions. What are you going to do after this session? And for gosh sake, if it's go to the Dairy Queen on the other side of town, just go. That's okay. I can tell you the address. But if you're going to take some time and process what you've heard today, I'd like to hear that as well. Now, we're not going to pick these up. So the only place I'm going to hear it is in my own head. I pick up energy from all over the place. The second thing I'd like to know from you that I want you to tell yourself, this is self-commitment, is that what are you going to do tomorrow about this? One of the things that Christine said earlier today is please don't call me the day before the application is due to ask me the question that's going to take me a week and a half to figure out and you another week and a half to resort in your application. So what are you going to do tomorrow? What will happen within the next week? If you came with key partners, start talking about who other key partners should be brought into the conversation. You know, think about who it is that you can start building out towards. Take a hard look at those results areas and begin figuring out where you might want to focus. And then recognize that once you get through the community planning process, you might be taken in a completely different direction. And what are you going to do within the next month? And here's my personal hope for you, is that in the next month, at least once a week, you give yourself a nap. Yes, I did say nap. That's N as in Nancy, A as in Albert, P as in Paul. Give yourself a nap. We have so much work in front of us, and it's changing as we sit here, that you have to take care of yourselves. You have to be mindful about what you've committed to and how you've committed yourself. So look at the person next to you and make a commitment to them that your gift to yourself during the next month is that once a week you're going to take a nap. Talk to her, tell her. Talk to her, tell her. Come on, do this. It's not that hard. Make a commitment. Oh. Woo! Dang. That was the dance portion of the program. I want to thank you on behalf of Kathleen and myself. Trying to figure out how to make this thing make sense was not the easiest work in the world. I hope that we gave you little kernels that you can take back to your place and put into practice. If you don't, as I said, Christine has our contact information. You've been excellent. You've been engaged. I want to thank you for participating today. Christine.
I'll just do both. Okay, thank you again, David and Kathleen, for helping us out with this. Are there any other questions anybody has? Now, I'm not gonna run for the hills as soon as I drop the mic and get out of here, so I'll be around for 15, 20 minutes or so. If you have other questions you want to ask, feel free to stop me and ask them. But does anybody have any final questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, one thing I do want to let you know, and I didn't say this earlier, is that this whole program and this whole idea of community-driven projects is new to HealthPath. We've never done this before. So we have absolutely no idea how this is going to go. So you guys are sort of our test cases, and you're our pilot projects. You're our guinea pigs, so to speak. So you'll be learning along with us, and so we really value your feedback. So, I encourage you, if you have multiple projects and multiple communities you're working in, to approach us with more than one project. Like I said before, in the past, we've never given out a grant to, 2 grants to the same organization, but maybe this year we'll find that we will, because each community is so different. So, you know, I encourage you to give us feedback, let us know how this goes so we can make it better for you in the future. Also, in your packets is an orange, like a light orange piece of paper. That's an evaluation. We want you to tell us how we did today. Did we make sense? Was everything clear? Was the room too hot? Yes, it was. We all know that. Were the snacks okay? You know, give us your feedback. Let us know how it was. We'll use that for future workshops to make them better. And also, if you have suggestions or topics that you'd like to see us talk about in the future, we'd love to hear those as well. We do webinars sometimes on different topics. We offer capacity building workshops on different things. So if there's something that you or your community wants to know about and wants to learn about, please let us know what those are. I'm also going to give you a tiny sneak peek into something else we're trying this year. The information will come out probably next week sometime, but we're going to dip our toe in the water of crowdfunding. So we are going to give, we're only going to give about 8 grants out, so it's probably going to be very competitive, but starting in January, we're going to run a couple webinars on how do you put together a crowdfunding campaign. How do you do it right, and what's really realistic? Crowdfunding campaigns do not make millions of dollars. Crowdfunding campaigns on average make $7,000. That's the average successful campaign, that's what they make. So we're going to do some webinars to help people in our service area put together a successful campaign. We're going to offer a small grant to help you pay to implement a campaign, and then we're going to match you on the back end, dollar for dollar up to $5,000 on what you raised during your crowdfunding campaign. In order to participate, in order to apply, you must participate in that first webinar, which, like I said, we'll send out information next week. You guys are on our mailing list. You'll hear about it. But if you've ever wanted to explore crowdfunding for your organization, this would be your chance to do that. So, like I said, we'll be around if you guys have any other questions on behalf of Eric, Tara, Kara, and myself, and HealthPath. We really thank you guys for coming today, and we look forward to seeing what you can do with your communities next year.